Chapter 8 of A Chronicle of the Pontiac War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Chronicle of the Pontiac War by Thomas Guthrie Marquis. Chapter 8 Winding Up the Indian War. Amherst was weary of America. Early in the summer of 1763 he had asked to be relieved of his command, but it was not until October that General Thomas Gage, then in charge of the government of Montreal, was appointed to succeed him, and not until November 17, the day after Gage arrived in New York, that Amherst sailed for England. The new commander-in-chief was not as great a general as Amherst. It is doubtful if he could have planned and brought to a successful conclusion such campaigns as the siege of Louisbourg and the threefold march of 1760 on Montreal, which have given his predecessor a high place in the military history of North America. But Gage was better suited for winding up the Indian War. He knew the value of the officers familiar with the Indian tribes, and was ready to act on their advice. Amherst had not done this, and his best officers were now anxious to resign. George Krogen had resigned as Assistant Superintendent of Indian Affairs, but was later induced by Gage to remain in office. Gladwin was heartily wearied of his command and hoped to be relieved soon. Blaine and Urry were tired of their posts, and the brave Ecuyer was writing in despair, "For God's sake, let me go and raise cabbages." Bouquet, too, although determined to see the war to a conclusion, was not satisfied with the situation. Meanwhile, Sir William Johnstone was not idle among the tribes of the Six Nations. The failure of Pontiac to reduce Fort Detroit and the victory of Bouquet at Edge Hill had convinced the Iroquois that ultimately the British would triumph, and eager to be on the winning side, they consented to take the field against the Shawnees and Delawares. In the middle of February 1764, through Johnson's influence and by his aid, 200 Tuscaroras and Oneidas, under a half-breed, Captain Montour, marched westward. Near the main branch of the Susquehanna they surprised 40 Delawares, on a scalping expedition against the British settlements, and made prisoners of the entire party. A few weeks later a number of Mohawks led by Joseph Brant, Thayendanegea, put another band of Delawares to rout, killing their chief and taking 3 prisoners. These attacks of the Iroquois disheartened the Shawnees and Delawares and greatly alarmed the Senecas, who, trembling lest their own country should be laid waste, sent a deputation of 400 of their chief men to Johnson Hall, Sir William Johnson's residence on the Mohawk, to sue for peace. It was agreed that the Senecas should at once stop all hostilities, never again take up arms against the British, deliver up all prisoners at Johnson Hall, cede to His Majesty the Niagara carrying place, allow the free passage of troops through their country, renounce all intercourse with the Delawares and Shawnees, and assist the British in punishing them. Thus, early in 1764, through the energy and diplomacy of Sir William Johnson, the powerful Senecas were brought to terms. With the opening of spring preparations began in earnest for a twofold invasion of Indian country. One army was to proceed to Detroit by way of Niagara and the Lakes, and another from Fort Pitt to take the field against the Delawares and the Shawnees. To Colonel John Bradstreet, who in 1758 had won distinction by his capture of Fort Frontenac, was assigned the command of the contingent that was to go on to Detroit. Bradstreet was to punish the Wyandots of Sandusky, and likewise the members of the Ottawa Confederacy, if he should find them hostile. He was also to relieve Gladwin and re-garrison the forts captured by the Indians in 1763. Bradstreet left Albany in June with a large force of colonial troops and regulars, including 300 French Canadians from the St Lawrence, whom Gage had thought it wise to have enlisted, in order to impress upon the Indians that they need no longer expect assistance from the French in their wars against the British. To prepare the way for Bradstreet's arrival, Sir William Johnson had gone in advance to Niagara, where he had called together ambassadors from all tribes, not only from those that had taken part in the war, but from all within his jurisdiction. He had found a vast concourse of Indians awaiting him. The wigwams of over 1,000 warriors dotted the low-lying land at the mouth of the river. In a few days the number had grown to 2,000, representatives of nations as far east as Nova Scotia, as far west of the Mississippi, and as far north as the Hudson Bay. Pontiac was absent, nor were there any Delaware, Shawnee, or Seneca ambassadors present. These were absent through dread, but later the Senecas sent deputies to ratify the treaty made with Johnson in April. When Bradstreet and his troops arrived negotiations were in full swing. For nearly a month councils were held, and at length all the chiefs present had entered into an alliance with the British. This accomplished, Johnson, on August 6, left Niagara for his home, while Bradstreet continued his journey towards Detroit. Bradstreet halted at Presque Isle. Here he was visited by pretended deputies from the Shawnees and Delawares who ostensibly sought peace. He made a conditional treaty with them and agreed to meet them 25 days later at Sandusky, where they were to bring their British prisoners. From Presque Isle he wrote to Bouquet at Fort Pitt, saying that it would be unnecessary to advance into the Delaware country, as the Delawares were now at peace. He also reported his success, as he considered it, to Gage, but Gage was not impressed. He disavowed the treaty and instructed Bouquet to continue his preparations. Continuing his journey, Bradstreet rested at Sandusky, where more Delawares waited on him and agreed to make peace. It was at this juncture that he sent Captain Thomas Morris on his ill-starred mission to the tribes of Mississippi. Morris and his companions got no further than the rapids of Maumee, where they were seized, stripped of clothing, and threatened with death. Pontiac was now among the Miamis, still striving to get together a following to continue the war. The prisoners were taken to Pontiac's camp, but the Ottawa chief did not deem it wise to murder a British officer on this occasion, and Morris was released and forced to retrace his steps. He arrived at Detroit after the middle of September, only to find that Bradstreet had already departed. The story will be found in more detail in Parkman's Conspiracy of Pontiac. Bradstreet was at Detroit by August 26, and at last the worn-out garrison and the fort could rest after 15 months of exacting duties. Calling the Indians to council, Bradstreet entered into treaties with a number of chiefs, and pardoned several French settlers who had taken an active part with the Indians in the siege of Detroit. He then sent troops to occupy Michilimackinac, Green Bay, and Sault Ste. Marie, and sailed for Sandusky to meet the Delawares and Shawnees, who had promised to bring in their prisoners. But none awaited him. The Indians had deliberately deceived him and were playing for time while they continued their attacks on the border settlers. Here he received a letter from Gage ordering him to disregard the treaty he had made with the Delawares and to join Bouquet at Fort Pitt, an order which Bradstreet did not obey, making the excuse that the low state of the water in the rivers made it impossible an advance to Fort Pitt. On October 18 he left Sandusky for Niagara, having accomplished nothing except occupation of the forts. Having already blundered hopelessly in dealing with the Indians, he was to blunder still further. On his way down Lake Erie he encamped one night, when storm threatened, on an exposed shore, and a gale from the northeast broke upon his camp and destroyed half his boats. 280 of his soldiers had to march overland to Niagara. Many of them perished. Others, starved, exhausted, frostbitten, came staggering in by twos and threes till near the end of December. The expedition was a fiasco. It blasted Bradstreet's reputation, and made the British name for a time contemptible among the Indians. The other expedition from Fort Pitt has a different history. All through the summer Bouquet had been recruiting troops for the invasion of the Delaware country. The soldiers were slow in arriving, and it was not until the end of September that all was ready. Early in October Bouquet marched out of Fort Pitt with 1,000 provincials and 500 regulars. Crossing the Allegheny, he made his way in a northwesterly direction until Beaver Creek was reached, and then turned westward into the unbroken forest. The Indians of the Muskingum Valley felt secure in their wilderness fastness. No white soldiers had ever penetrated to their country. To reach their villages dense woods had to be penetrated, treacherous marches crossed, and numerous streams bridged or forded. But by the middle of October Bouquet had led his army, without the loss of a man, into the heart of the Muskingum Valley, and pitched his camp near an Indian village named Tuscarora, from which the inhabitants had fled at his approach. The Delawares and Shawnees were terrified. The victor of Edge Hill was among them with an army strong enough to crush to atoms any war party they could muster. They sent deputies to Bouquet. These at first assumed a haughty mien, but Bouquet sternly rebuked them and ordered them to meet him at the forks of the Muskingum, 40 miles distant to the southwest, and to bring in all their prisoners. By the beginning of November the troops were at the appointed place, where they encamped. Bouquet then sent messengers to all the tribes telling them to bring thither all the captives without delay. Every white man, woman, and child in their hands, French or British, must be delivered up. After some hesitation the Indians made haste to obey. About 200 captives were brought, and chiefs were left as hostages for the safe delivery of others still in the hands of distant tribes. So far Bouquet had been stern and unbending; he had reminded the Indians of their murder of settlers and of their black treachery regarding the garrisons, and hinted that, except for the kindness of their British father, they would be utterly destroyed. He now unbent, and offered them a generous treaty, which was to be drawn up and arranged later by Sir William Johnson. Bouquet then retraced his steps to Fort Pitt, and arrived there on November 28 with his long train of released captives. He had won a victory over the Indians greater than his triumph at Edge Hill, and all the greater in that it was achieved without striking a blow. There was still, however, important work to be done before any guarantee of permanent peace in the hinterland was possible. On the eastern bank of the Mississippi, within the country ceded to England by the Treaty of Paris, was an important settlement over which the French flag still flew, and to which no British troops or invaders had penetrated. It was a hotbed of conspiracy. Even while Bouquet was making peace with the tribes between the Ohio and Lake Erie, Pontiac and his agents were trying to make trouble for the British among the Indians of the Mississippi. French settlement on the Mississippi began at the village of Kaskaskia, 84 miles north of the mouth of the Ohio. 6 miles still farther north was Fort Chart, a strongly built stone fort capable of accommodating 300 men. From here, at some distance from the river, a road ran to Cahokia, a village situated nearly opposite the site of the present city of St. Louis. The intervening country was settled by prosperous traders and planters who, including their 400 negro slaves, numbered not less than 2,000. But when it was learned that all the territory east of the great river had been ceded to Britain, the settlers began to migrate to the opposite bank. The French here were hostile to the incoming British, and feared lest they might now lose the profitable trade with New Orleans. It was this region that Gage was determined to occupy. Already an effort had been made to reach Fort Chart. In February 1864 Major Arthur Loftus had been sent out from New Orleans with 400 men, but when, about 240 miles north of his starting point, his 2 leading boats were fired upon by Indians. 6 men were killed and 4 wounded. To advance would mean the destruction of his entire company. Loftus returned to New Orleans, blaming the French officials for not supporting his enterprise, and indeed hinting that they were responsible for the attack. Some weeks later Captain Philip Pittman arrived at New Orleans with the intention of ascending the river, but reports of the enmity of the Indians to the British made him abandon the undertaking. So at the beginning of 1765 the French flag still flew over Fort Chart, and Saint-Ange, who had succeeded Neyon de Villiers as a commander of the fort, was praying that the British might soon arrive to relieve him from a position where he was being daily importuned by Pontiac or his emissaries for aid against what they called the common foe. But if the route to Fort Chart by way of New Orleans was too dangerous, Bouquet had cleared the Ohio of enemies, and the country which Gage sought to occupy was now accessible by way of that river. As a preliminary step, George Krogen was sent in advance with presents for the Indians along the route. In May 1765 Krogen left Fort Pitt accompanied by a few soldiers and a number of friendly Shawnee and Delaware chiefs. Near the mouth of the Wabash a prowling band of Kickapoos attacked the party, killing several and making prisoners of the rest. Krogen and his fellow prisoners were taken to the French traders at Vincennes, where they were liberated. They then went to Ouatanon, where Krogen held a council, and induced many chiefs to swear fealty to the British. After leaving Ouatanon, Krogen had proceeded westward but a little way when he was met by Pontiac, with a number of chiefs and warriors. At last the arch-conspirator was ready to come to terms. The French on the Mississippi would give him no assistance. He realized now that his people were conquered, and before it was too late he must make peace with his conquerors. Krogen had no further reason to continue his journey, so accompanied by Pontiac he went to Detroit. Arriving there on August 17 he at once called a council of the tribes in the neighbourhood. At this council sat Pontiac, among the chiefs whom he had led during the months of the siege of Detroit. But it was no longer the same Pontiac. His haughty, domineering spirit was broken; his hopes of an Indian empire were at an end. "Father," he said at this council, "I declare to all nations that I had made my peace with you before I came here, and I now deliver my pipe to Sir William Johnson, that he may know that I have made peace, and taken the King of England to be my father in the presence of all the nations now assembled." He further agreed to visit Oswego in the spring to conclude a treaty with Sir William Johnson himself. The path was now clear for the advance of the troops to Fort Chartres. As soon as news of Croghan's success reached Fort Pitt, Captain Thomas Sterling, with 120 men of the Black Watch, set out in boats for the Mississippi, arriving on October 9 at Fort Chartres, the first British troops to set foot in that country. Next day St Ange handed the keys of the fort to Sterling, and the Union Jack was flung aloft. Thus, nearly 3 years after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the fleur de lis disappeared from the territory then known as Canada. There is still to record the closing act in the public career of Pontiac. Sir William Johnson, fearing that the Ottawa chief might fail to keep his promise of visiting Oswego to ratify the treaty made with Krogen at Detroit, sent Hugh Crawford, in March 1766, with belts and messages to the chiefs of the Ottawa Confederacy. But Pontiac was already preparing for his journey eastward. Nothing in his life was more creditable than his bold determination to attend a council far from his hunting ground, at which he would be surrounded by soldiers who had suffered treachery and cruelty at his hands, whose comrades he had tortured and murdered. On July 23 there began at Oswego the Grand Council, at which Sir William Johnson and Pontiac were the most conspicuous figures. For 3 days the ceremonies and speeches continued, and on the 3rd day Pontiac rose in the assembly and made a promise that he was faithfully to keep. "I take the Great Spirit to witness," he said, "that what I am going to say I am determined steadfastly to perform. While I had the French king by the hand, I kept a fast hold of it; and now, having you, father, by the hand, I shall do the same in conjunction with all the western nations in my district." Before the council ended Johnson presented to each of the chiefs a silver medal engraved with the words, "A pledge of peace and friendship with Great Britain, confirmed in 1766." He also loaded Pontiac and his brother chiefs with presents; then, on the last day of July, the Indians scattered to their homes. For 3 years Pontiac, like a restless spirit, moved from camp to camp and from hunting ground to hunting ground. There were outbreaks of hostilities in the Indian country, but in none of these did he take part. His name never appears in the records of those 3 years. His days of conspiracy were at an end. By many of the French and Indians he was distrusted as a pensioner of the British, and by the British traders and settlers he was hated for his past deeds. In 1769 he visited the Mississippi, and while at Cahokia he attended a drunken frolic held by some Indians. When he left the feast, stupid from the effects of rum, he was followed into the forest by a Kaskaskia Indian, probably bribed by a British trader. And as Pontiac lurched among the black shadows of the trees, his pursuer crept up behind him, and with a swift stroke of the tomahawk cleft his skull. Thus by a treacherous blow ended the career of a warrior whose chief weapon had been treachery. For 12 years England, by means of military officers, ruled the great hinterland east of the Mississippi, a region vast and rich, which now teems with a population immensely greater than that of the whole broad dominion of Canada, a region which is today dotted with such magnificent cities as Chicago, Detroit, and Indianapolis. Unhappily, England made no effort to colonize this wilderness empire. Indeed, as Edmund Burke has said, she made an attempt to keep as a lair of wild beasts that earth which God, by an express charter, had given to the children of men. She forbade settlement in the hinterland. She did this ostensibly for the Indians, but in reality for the merchants in the mother country. In a report of the Lords Commissioners for Trade and Plantations in 1772 are words which show that it was the intention of the government to confine the western extent of settlements to such a distance from the seaboard as those settlements should lie within easy reach of the trade and commerce of this kingdom, and also of the exercise of that authority and jurisdiction, necessary for the preservation of the colonies in a due subordination to, and dependence upon, the mother country. It does appear to us that the extension of the fur trade depends entirely upon the Indians being undisturbed in the possession of their hunting grounds. Let the savages enjoy their deserts in quiet. Were they driven from their forests the peltry trade would decrease, and it is not impossible that worse savages would take refuge in them. Much has been written about the stamp tax and the tea tax as causes of the American Revolution, but this determination to confine the colonies to the Atlantic seaboard rendered the Revolution inevitable. Roosevelt's The Winning of the West, Part I, p. 57. In 1778, 3 years after the sword was drawn, when an American force under George Rogers Clark invaded the Indian country, England's weakly garrisoned posts, then by the Quebec Act under the government of Canada, were easily captured, and when accounts came to be settled after the war, the entire hinterland south of the Great Lakes, from the Alleghanies to the Mississippi, passed to the United States. Chapter IX.